Good morning. I thought I should start. For those who don't know me so well, I'm Jeanette. I'm an elder here. But even those who do know me may not know a bit more what I do during the week. I'm a mission action partner for Churches of Christ, which means I'm actually a minister, but a minister not attached to a church. So we do a lot of work with community. We do a lot of work with our care services, connecting our care services, our churches, our communities together. One of my particular roles is I run a psychology and counselling service for Churches of Christ. You need to understand that background to understand where I'm coming from for what I'm going to say today. We're heading up to Christmas, and Dean and I leave on Friday for our annual trip down south to spend Christmas with our family, which we're really looking forward to. It's been a hard year, we're really tired. But I want to take you back to last January, the end of our trip down there last year, the last few days. And we've got a slide which shows some of the photos, Michael. But just picture this, January 20, we're starting to pack up, get ready for our road trip back home again. The children have all gone back to work. Melbourne is still very much in holiday mode. Melbourne really slows down during January. The city tends to be full of bargain shoppers with the after Christmas sales, parents who are stocking up on school supplies, tourists who are wandering around taking advantage. Really peaceful place. A speeding car smashes into Burke Street Mall, mounts the curbs and heads straight for several groups of people wandering around the mall. Bodies everywhere, blood everywhere. You can see the photo there of the pram. There were a couple of prams that were just thrown across the way. The driver then starts targeting further pedestrians, speeds off down Burke Street with police cars following, sirens blaring. It's a mess. Our eldest daughter, Christy, and our other daughter, Bree, both work in the city. Christy's office is less than a block away. Up on the left is the view almost from her window. I phone her thinking, is she in the office? Is she out doing messages? Was she around? She's there wondering what's going on and being busy putting the building into lockdown mode because they didn't know what had happened. That day, 6 people died. Dozens more were injured, and Melbourne was in shock. They're starting to prepare for the 12-month memorial next month. This is the main street of our peaceful home city. Everyone just going about doing their business. And suddenly this happens. We were pretty dazed and distressed, trying to make sense of what this was all about. As we headed back, started our drive back home again. We get back here, we're starting to get organised and back into work mode. Dean's back on the Friday. I'm preparing to go back on the Monday. We get a phone call from the GP. You've got to take Dean to hospital right now. Why? What's happened? He said, I've got the results of your blood tests from this morning and it's not good. You've got no immunity. You've got to go to the hospital, go to A&E, tell them that you've got to go into protective isolation. And we thought, but we've just been down the street shopping, we've had coffee together, we've been around lots of people, there can't be anything wrong. He's no different to who he was yesterday. Of course, most of you will know that 3 days later he was diagnosed with an acute severe form of leukaemia and given 30 to 40% chance of survival. That was our January. 2 major tragedies in just over a week happened to us. When this happens, how do we make sense of it? Now, I'm talking about a pretty depressing topic. In the middle of the Christmas season, when we're singing about joy. Is that better? Can you hear me better? Sorry. Why am I talking about this now? The reality is that these things do happen this time of year. And for people who experience tragedy at Christmas time, it can be doubly isolating. Everyone else is in celebration mode. And here I am trying to come to grips with how my world's fallen apart. Kerry when talking about happiness last week, talked about how being Christian doesn't mean that we're immune. These things happen to us. So the second slide here, these are the three questions I want to try to address today. Where is God in the midst of tragedy when it happens? How can we make sense of it when the unthinkable happens to us? And how do you keep going when you know life is never going to be the same again? The questions I've grappled with all my life, and we have a lot this year. Now, I'm not actually going to talk much about what happened to us this year. Jim's actually asked Dean to talk about that next February, so you'll have to stay tuned. That'll be part 2 of this sermon. But these questions have come up for me personally, professionally, spiritually, and I've grappled with how do I make sense of it. It happens to all of us. Car accidents, natural disasters, acts of evil. They can and do occur to all of us at different times of our lives. And we've got to find a way, despite this, to embrace life and to keep going. Now, one of the things that I've learnt along the way is not to be afraid to listen to what our own experience tells us and to listen to what God is whispering inside you, to tune in to that small, still voice of God. Dean and I have had many blessings over our lives. So we've had a really good life, but we've also had our share of tragedies throughout our lives. If I start thinking about my life, when I was 2 years old, I lost my older sister to leukemia. So in some ways, this has come back to haunt me this year. When I was a teenager, as a result of the stress on the family because of that, my parents separated. That for me was devastating. As a young mum, I lost my own mother. So in the first 3 decades of my life, I had 3 major tragedies. For Dean and I on our journey together, we've survived so many things. Bushfires, floods, several episodes of serious illness, severe business stress, unemployment, and other unexpected things that have happened along the way. And yet we have had a wonderful life. We've had wonderful, so many joys along the way as well. How do you weigh them up? Everyone, I think, who's lived into their adult life has had their share of joys, but they've also had their share of tragedies. Now, I want each of you for a minute just to close your eyes and to think back over your lives. Close your eyes. Have you ever had a time when you felt like you were doing everything right and the unthinkable happened? Have you ever had a time when you felt that God had abandoned you? Or questioned even whether he existed? And while your eyes are closed, if you can say yes to either of those questions, put your hand up. Your eyes are closed, you don't have to worry. Put your hand up, hold it up, hold it up. Okay, now open your eyes. And if you look around, I would have counted about 50% of people who put their hands up. And I bet you out of the rest of you, most of you have thought, yeah, it has happened to me sometime. It's really common. The Bible, too, is filled with tragedies and with stories of unfairness. I've got just a few on this slide. Joseph, favourite son, His brothers, in jealousy, sold him into slavery, and then to add to the tragedy, turned around to his father and said he'd been killed. Job, the book of Job, is all about a man who's absolutely devastated, loses everything worth living for, on some whim, some sort of bargain between God and the devil. John the Baptist, Herod decided he was going to pander to a young girl's wish and he beheaded him. If you look in Acts, Herod arrests two people, James and Peter. He decides to put James to death and he throws Peter into prison. Now, because Peter's still alive, he's able to move on from that. An angel rescues him and he goes on and he does some amazing stuff for God. James, who, if you read, was so gifted, had so much, really dedicated his life to God. He didn't get a chance to show what he could do. He never got a chance to fulfill that potential. Think about Jesus, the crucifixion, the unfairness, this adoring crowd who 5 days later is calling for his crucifixion. He didn't deserve that. And the story of the early church is filled with stories of martyrs. Stephen and his stoning, all the early evangelists, the early church, the Christians being thrown to the lions in the Colosseum. It's full of them. And it's only human nature to ask why. Why was Peter saved and not James? If I think about my life, I can be justified in asking, why did this happen to me? Why didn't God listen to my pleas when I prayed to him about this? Why, when I thought I was doing God's will and I can see the fruits of my work, did things turn around and go so drastically wrong? I've spent half my life trying to make sense of this question, and I've come to the conclusion that it's the wrong question to ask. Asking why goes nowhere. It doesn't give us an easy answer. And it doesn't help us move on from that place of hurt, that place of tragedy where we feel beaten down. The Old Testament writers, people in Old Testament times, tended to see misfortune as something sent by God as punishment for sin. But if you look at what Jesus had to say, Jesus said this is too simplistic. There are a couple of instances. One instance is where he healed someone and they said, oh, look, why was this man born blind from birth? And he said it's actually to glorify God. He didn't say because the man had done something wrong or their parents had done something wrong. Jesus said, I've come that they may have life and have it to the full. That's not someone who's saying God's going to punish you for every little thing you've done wrong, that you're going to have disaster after disaster. So how do we make sense of tragedies? If asking why doesn't help, how do we make sense of them? Biblical passages like those in Jeremiah and Isaiah say clearly that God wants only what is good. So if you have a look at the Jeremiah quote, I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you and not to harm you. God's saying clearly, I'm not planning to harm you. He's not saying that it won't happen, that you won't have harm and tragedy, but that's not my plan. Isaiah, which is the next one, says that misfortune and tragedy is part of everyone's lives. You look at the way that this is written. He sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. Implied in that is that we all have our times of suffering. And Jesus' purpose was to raise us above that. to comfort us and to help us to find freedom and ways of breaking through that. So we've certainly had our fair share of misfortunes over the years. Today I want to particularly talk about a different family story to what's happened to us this year. I want to talk about the story of our daughter, Bree, the middle of our 3 children. Bree married Sam on an absolutely perfect late autumn Melbourne day under the elms at Ripple and Lee. There were 2 Churches of Christ ministers officiating. The one you can see there is Paul Cameron, who was CEO of Victoria Tasmania Conference. Also 1 Anglican bishop. So they had 3 ministers in the service. Talk about blessing. They were well covered with God's blessing. And after a long and up and down courtship, this was an absolutely beautiful day of promise for the future. Wow, that's what we thought. Next photo shows Sam's family. So Sam's father, Tony, we've got the photographer getting them organised on the left, Sam's father, Tony, then his mother, Joan, Sam, Bree, and Sam's 2 brothers, Andrew and Matthew. Sam, at the time that he was married, had been ill and had actually was out of work taking some time out, but was improving. So again, there was hope and promise there that before long he would be back in the workforce and doing well. They went off on a long holiday, 4-wheel drive trip around half of Australia, had an amazing time. Came back in July to the news that Bree's company was going to be closed and that she was shortly going to be out of work as well. So this was the start of a saga which I believe rivals Job's story. I'm going to give you a quick, brief summary of the things that happened to them over the first 2.5 years of marriage. And I've worked on this and I've had to condense it. But Bree's out of work, Sam's out of work. October, Joan suffers a relapse of her bowel cancer. And they're saying, we can't do a lot, within 12 months she'll be dead. We then, early the following year, move up to Brisbane to start work there. So at a time when they need people around them to support them, we weren't physically there. We move in March, a few days after we're gone, Joan dies, much earlier than they expected. Bree wasn't even there. She was away in work and stuck because they cancelled her plane. She couldn't get back. Exactly 3 months after Joan's death, Sam's father, Tony, suddenly remarries. He has a period of time of being predictable, irrational. He pushes his sons away. There's this big family rift, a blow up. And to add to what's already happened, the family disintegrates. Sam loses contact with his brothers, and he's still not in touch with them years later. So any wonder then that what we saw happening next was both Bree and Sam starting to slide into clinical depression, and it was getting worse and worse. They're battling this. They know what to do. They know how to work with it, but so much has happened. And then they have a spot of luck. Sam finally gets a job again. On the strength of 2 wages, Bree's still main wage earner, they decide they're going to buy a house. So it's all looking up. Settlement day comes and Bree's retrenched from her job. 2 months later, Sam also is retrenched. So, coming up to their 3rd wedding anniversary, Sam had lost his mother, his family was totally shattered, we were too far away to support them, they had no work, they were $500,000 in debt, and they were borrowing more money every week just to survive. Their mental health was really fragile, and because of all this stress, they kept getting sick. Everything that was going around, they came down with. How do you pick yourself up from that? Not easily. So how did they get through? On their fridge is a magnet holding this worn, tattered bit of paper that's been there for over 5 years. It's a copy of Philippians chapter 4, verses 5 to 9. Bree says that it helped them to get through the worst times. Let's read it. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guide your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. Whatever you have learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, put it into practice, and the God of peace will be with you. Really fine sentiments, but at times where you're absolutely crushed by life, how do you put them into practice? The interesting thing is that Paul wrote this letter to the Philippians from prison. So he was actually imprisoned by the Romans. The Philippian church was being absolutely persecuted. He knew what he was talking about. He knew who he was giving this message to. So I want to take from this 2 rules that Paul's teaching us to follow when we're faced with tragedy. So, immediately before this is the passage that Kerry referred to last week. Verse 4, rejoice in the Lord always. The Philippians, they're being persecuted right, left and centre, and Paul is saying to them, rejoice. I've had people sit in my office in the depths of clinical depression and saying, I feel so guilty because as a Christian I'm supposed to be joyful all the time and I can't feel that joy. Now that wasn't what Paul was talking about. What he was talking about was something that comes from the depth of my heart. Not a superficial happiness, but the deep joy that comes with loving and knowing God. And knowing that God's there for you and that God's got this, whatever it is. He wasn't saying paste on artificial smiles and go around dancing and happy and singing Christmas carols and not thinking about any of your troubles. But to connect with that deep joy, even when you're in the depths of despair. At times like that, the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds, and it will get you through. One of the things that I'll often do with my clients when they're going through tough times is to get them to keep a gratitude diary. I ask them, depending on whether they're verbal or visual, either to write down or to take photos of 3 things every day. Now, these things have to be things that either make them happy, make them smile, or things that they're grateful for. And it doesn't matter how small it is. Now, when you're really in the depths of despair, trying to think of even a simple thing that makes you happy can feel like pulling yourself up by your bootlaces, but it works. There used to be a song around when I was a child, count your blessings one by one. Some of you would know it. But this is what this is about. Because clinically what happens, when we feel down, our mind goes into protective overdrive and it is totally preoccupied with scanning for danger. I must keep keep myself safe. So this becomes such a habit, becomes so ingrained that it's not long before we don't notice any of the blessings, any of the wonderful things that happen around us. I can remember one time in my life where I was feeling like this and I was really struggling with some health problems. And someone said to me, "But you've got so much to be grateful for." And I looked around at my beautiful house, my lovely children, my husband, the people who I love dearly and who are my life. And it felt like it was nothing. The pain was too great. But to make a habit of connecting with that, to write your list, keep your photo albums, but keep building on it every day, it does turn you around. It works. There's actually been studies done that have shown that you do that for 6 weeks, 3 things every day. We retrain the brain to get that balance back again. We retrain the brain to actually tune in to the joys and to experience the joys at the same time that we're experiencing the despair. So this is particularly important at times of grief and tragedy. So this is what verse 8 here is about, what Paul says. "Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things." Now, when I was talking with Bree about this, she actually told me something specific about this. She said, this particular verse was a huge help to remind me to focus on the good parts of the world amongst it all, to cultivate a willful appreciation and focus on the beauty around us despite everything. A tasty sandwich, a beautiful flower, acts of small kindnesses, etc. A side effect of this is that I'm now moved more than ever to emotion by art and music of different types. Another side effect I observed this year in her supporting us with going through illness was her ability to find that and draw that out of me, out of all of us, and to help us to tune in and to do that. And I needed the reminders. Bree says, "I learned a new word last week. Duende, I think that's how you pronounce it. The spirit of evocation. It's a flamenco term. It comes from inside as a physical, emotional response to art. It's what gives you chills, makes you smile or cry as a bodily reaction to an artistic performance that is particularly expressive. You can imagine the flamenco dancers expressing the music with their full body and soul." And that's what this is about. No matter what is happening, the beauty is still there. It's just that our minds have stopped registering it, but we can turn that round. Bree would often look at everything that had happened and she'd say to me, "You know what? If our marriage can survive all this, then we can survive anything." She was drawing that from it. While they found it a hard battle, bit by bit, they tried to focus on the good things around them. And each time they did, things looked a bit better and they felt a bit better. It's good to see that now they're both doing pretty well and they're finding things in life to enjoy, even though this year has been hard for all of us. So, Paul's first message to the Philippians was to rejoice, even in the midst of despair. And hopefully I've unpacked that a little bit to understand a little bit more what he meant by that. The second thing is to learn to hand your burdens to Christ, to let petitions and praises shape your worries into prayers, letting God know your concerns. Paul doesn't promise that God will make your problems disappear, but he does promise a sense of God's wholeness that will give you strength. This, for me, was a battle for many years. I would pray to God, "I want to hand over this burden to you, God. Take this burden from me." And I would wonder why God didn't solve my problems and why I still felt distressed by things that were going on. It took me a long time to realise what I was doing. And it's summed up in that tug of war. Here, God, here's my problems, but I'm not going to let go of them. Have a look at the expressions on their faces, the strain, the stress, the energy that requires to keep hanging on to my burdens. It's only when we can really let go and leave a problem with God that we can actually find peace, even if the problem's going on around us. In ACT therapy, we call this acceptance or expansion. It's a principle of recognising that no amount of fighting or hiding from the issues will change them. If things have gone wrong, we can't change a lot of the facts about it, no matter how hard they are to deal with. But what we can do is to recognise and acknowledge the pain and the hurt, to make room for it in our lives, and to focus on how we can move forward into a rich and fulfilling life despite the pain. To embrace and accept the tragedy and the pain, but to expand around it and be able to move forward even while it might still be there in our lives. Now, if we can do that, we can find this way to continue on, despite those burdens. And the irony is that when we can do this, we usually find that the pain diminishes and we can then really focus on moving forward. Won't necessarily go away, but it will diminish. We will take our attention off that and be able to take our attention onto what's going to give us the rich and fulfilling life, where we can actually reach our potential. We can actually express our gifts for God, regardless of what's happening in our lives. The serenity prayer, I reckon, sums this up perfectly. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. If you want to look that up, you've only got to Google it and you will find dozens of versions. That's the short version of the longer poem that was originally written. There's no easy answer to why did this happen. When I'm in the midst of tragedy and I'm wanting to ask this question, I'm usually too close to make sense of it anyway. But later, and sometimes it's a long time later, when I can step back from the disaster, take more of a helicopter view, I see it differently. Sometimes I can look back on a difficult experience and see it in a different way. See it as part of a wider tapestry with threads that connect through to other people and other events, other situations. Somehow that makes me richer. Somehow that helps me to find the richness even in that tragedy. My tragedies and disasters have changed me, and they've directed me in ways that I'm never going to be the same again. At times, they've taken me to places I would never have gone, though, and produced surprising and amazing results. Bree and Sam are now quite different people from when they married. There's grief and sadness in their lives about the loss of Sam's mother and about the family and the way the family's changed. But through actually practicing acceptance and gratitude, they've found peace and they've reconnected with joy. The tough stuff of life has given them deeper wisdom, deeper resilience, and absolutely greater empathy. They're also slowly rebuilding their relationship with Sam's father, and this is real delight to see. The relationship is different, it always will be. But they're learning to understand each other in this new space, and healing is gradually taking place too. They've learnt they can rely on each other, regardless of what life throws at them. As Bree said, if we can survive this, we'll survive anything. And they have that confidence. Their compassion for others is now based on life experience. and so they're much better equipped to help other people when they're going through the difficult times. Does it justify their pain? No. But it does help them to move forward and to accept the past. They can celebrate some positives that have come out of a really tough time of life. Think back, I mentioned Joseph earlier when we were talking about the Bible characters. If you would know bits of Joseph's story, but if you haven't ever sat down and read through his story in the Bible, right from the start to the finish, I'd encourage you to do this if you really want to get a handle on how do we survive through tragedy. Things come up there that you don't obviously see when you look at just part of the story. Every time things were going well, something would bring Joseph down again. He really had plenty of reasons to cry out as he did, "Why, God, have you forsaken me?" But then one day, Joseph's brothers come seeking food to survive the drought, and the family is reunited. And the story, the start of the story of God's people, Joseph brings his family to Egypt. He brings the Jews to Egypt. He rescues them from starvation and saves the Jewish race to continue on God's path. I want to finish with a story, and this is a story that's come out of China, but I think brilliantly illustrates these 2 points that I've been making. Many years ago, in a poor Chinese village, there lived a farmer and his son. His only material possession, apart from the land and a small hut, was a horse that he'd inherited from his father. One day, the horse ran away, leaving the man with no animal with which to work the land. His neighbours went to his house to say how much they regretted his loss. He thanked them for their visit, but said, "How do you know that what has happened was a misfortune?" Someone muttered to a friend, "He obviously doesn't want to face facts, but let him think what he likes. After all, it's better than being sad about it." And the neighbours went away again, pretending to agree with what he'd said. A week later, the horse returned, but it was not alone. It brought with it a beautiful mare for company. The inhabitants of the village were thrilled, for only then did they understand the reply that the man had given them, and they went back to the farmer's house to congratulate him on his good fortune. "Instead of one horse, you've now got 2. Congratulations," they said. "Many thanks for your visit," replied the farmer. "But how do you know that what has happened is a blessing?" Neighbours were put out and decided the man must be going mad. And as they left, they said, "Doesn't the man realise that the horse is a gift from God?" A month later, the farmer's son decided to break the mare in. However, the animal bucked wildly and threw the boy off. The boy fell awkwardly and he broke his leg badly. The neighbours returned to the farmer's house, bringing presents for the injured boy. They were really supportive. The mayor of the village solemnly presented his condolences to the father, saying how sad they all were about what had occurred. The man thanked them for their visit and for their kindness, but he asked, "How do you know that what happened was a misfortune?" These words again left everyone dumbstruck, because they were all quite sure that the son's accident was a real tragedy. As they left the farmer's house, they said to each other, "Now he really has gone mad. His only son could be left permanently crippled, and he's not sure whether the accident was a misfortune or not." A few months later, Japan declared war on China. The emperor's emissaries scoured the country for healthy young men to be sent to the front. When they reached the village, they recruited all the young men except the farmer's son, whose leg had not yet mended. None of the men came back alive. Misfortune or blessing? It can be easy to judge too hastily. Thank you.